The gun in Lorenzo Moretti's hand wasn't shaking. It never did. What shook the room was who he was aiming at. Not a rival boss, not a traitor from a rival family, but a trembling young maid kneeling on the marble floor, her hands covered in blood, her body shielding his mother's wheelchair. Behind her, his fiancée was screaming, hysterical, pointing, begging him to pull the trigger. "She's a liar. She attacked us. She's a rat." Lorenzo had ordered executions for far less. One word from him, and the girl would disappear forever. But then his mother lifted her head barely conscious and whispered a single word. Poison. The room went silent. In that moment, Lorenzo realized something terrifying. If the maid was lying, he would destroy the woman he loved. If she was telling the truth, the monster sleeping beside him had already tried to kill his family. And either way, someone was about to die. This was the moment everything began. The scream came before the gunshot. A woman's voice, raw and broken, tearing through the polished silence of the Moretti mansion. Blood splattered across white marble. A wheelchair lay overturned. And in the center of it all, a young maid knelt on the floor, her hands shaking, her body shielding the most untouchable woman in the house. Lorenzo Moretti stood frozen at the doorway, rain still clinging to his coat, a gun heavy in his palm. That was the image burned into his memory forever. But the story did not begin there. It began hours earlier, on a morning that looked perfect. The Moretti estate woke beneath a pale gold sunrise, glass walls reflecting wealth and power like a fortress carved from light. Every movement was rehearsed, every sound measured. Servants moved quietly, heads lowered. Guards stood immobile, eyes scanning for threats that never reached this high. Lorenzo Moretti descended the marble staircase in a tailored black suit, his presence bending the room without effort. He was calm, controlled, the kind of man who ruled by silence more than force. At the foot of the stairs, Vanessa Sterling waited for him, radiant in a silk dress the color of morning cream. Her smile was warm, affectionate, flawless. The smile that had convinced New York's elite she was about to become the most powerful woman in the city. She stepped forward and straightened his tie with delicate fingers. Lorenzo leaned down, pressing a brief kiss to her temple before turning toward his mother's wing. "Take care of her today," he said casually. "She didn't sleep well." "Of course," Vanessa replied softly. "You know how much I adore her." Lorenzo nodded, satisfied, unaware that the word adore could mean so many different things when spoken by the wrong person. The gates closed behind him with a deep metallic echo. His convoy disappeared down the long private road. And in the space of a single breath, Vanessa Sterling's smile vanished. Only one person saw it happen. Sophie stood near the service hallway, holding a folded stack of linen against her chest. She was 22, small-framed, with eyes that noticed too much for her own good. She had learned early that survival meant blending into the walls, becoming invisible in houses built on power and secrets. The Moretti mansion was the last place someone like her should have been, but desperation had a way of erasing pride. Her father's debt had brought her here. Gambling, bad luck, worse choices. Men who didn't ask twice. The kind of debt that ended in broken fingers, or worse. Working for the Morettis wasn't safety, but it was time. Time was everything. Sophie lived by one rule: don't hear, don't see, don't exist. She repeated it silently as she pushed her cleaning cart down the corridor, her steps careful, her gaze fixed on the floor. But that morning, something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. When she reached the West Wing, she paused. A sound drifted through the hallway, soft, uneven, barely audible, a whisper wrapped in fear. "Someone, please." Sophie froze. No one called for help in the Moretti house. Not loudly, not ever. Her heart began to pound. She told herself to walk away, to turn back, to pretend she hadn't heard anything. But the voice came again, trembling, weak, unmistakably human. It was coming from Mrs. Isabella's room. Sophie swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the tray of tea she had been instructed to deliver. She told herself it was nothing. Perhaps a bad dream. Perhaps pain. But instinct, raw and urgent, pushed her forward. The door was slightly ajar. Sophie reached it, her breath shallow, and nudged it open just enough to look inside. The world shifted. Isabella Moretti sat in her wheelchair by the window, her silver hair disheveled, her wrists bound tightly to the armrests with a long silk scarf, the same ivory scarf Vanessa had worn the night before. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, eyes wide with terror. Standing in front of her was Vanessa. Her posture was relaxed, almost graceful. One hand rested lightly on the back of the wheelchair. The other held a porcelain teacup. steam curling upward like something alive. Her voice was gentle, soothing, sweet enough to deceive the devil himself. "You've always been so difficult," Vanessa said softly, "always clinging to control." Isabella shook her head weakly. "My son, he'll know," she whispered. "Lorenzo will see you for what you are." Vanessa laughed under her breath, a sound devoid of warmth. She leaned closer, lowering herself until their faces were level. Her smile sharpened. "Do you really think he'll believe you?" she asked. "A frail old woman with a failing heart, or the woman he chose to marry?" Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Sophie's vision blurred. Her pulse roared in her ears. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. Every instinct told her that she was standing at the edge of something fatal. Vanessa lifted the teacup slightly. "Drink," she murmured. "It will all be over soon." Sophie's foot shifted involuntarily against the floor. The sound was barely there, but Vanessa heard it. She straightened slowly, turning her head toward the door. Her eyes met Sophie's through the narrow opening. Time stopped. For a heartbeat. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Sophie felt as though the walls were closing in, her lungs refusing air. She knew, with terrifying clarity, that her life had just been divided into two halves before this moment, and whatever came after. Vanessa's expression softened into something almost kind. Then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that promised pain. Sophie stepped back, her hands trembling, her mind racing. She understood the truth in a single, devastating instant. If she spoke, she would die. If she stayed silent, Isabella would not survive the day. There was no safe choice. Vanessa moved toward the door, heels clicking softly against the floor, every step deliberate. Sophie's back hit the wall of the corridor, her heart slamming so violently she feared it would give her away. Vanessa stopped inches from her, close enough that Sophie could smell her perfume light. Floral. Expensive? "Did you see something?" Vanessa asked gently. Sophie shook her head, unable to speak. Vanessa studied her for a long moment, eyes dark and calculating, then reached out and adjusted the collar of Sophie's uniform as if they were sharing a private, intimate moment. "Good," she said quietly, "because some things were never meant to be seen." She turned and walked back into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Sophie slid down the wall, her legs giving out beneath her. Her chest burned, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from making a sound. From inside the room, Isabella's muffled sobs seeped through the walls. Sophie stared at the closed door, knowing she would never forget what lay beyond it. And she knew something else too. From this moment on, the Moretti mansion was no longer just a place of power. It was a battlefield. And Sophie, who had spent her entire life trying not to exist, had just become a threat. End of part 1. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. Sophie did not sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the silk scarf digging into Isabella Moretti's wrists, saw Vanessa's smile hovering just inches from cruelty. Morning arrived without relief, gray light slipping through narrow windows like an unwelcome witness. The mansion resumed its perfect rhythm, footsteps measured, voices low, doors opening and closing with mechanical precision. But to Sophie, everything sounded sharper, louder, dangerous. She moved through her duties as if walking through water, invisible, silent, obedient. That was how she survived. Yet now invisibility felt like betrayal. Every time she passed the West Wing, her chest tightened, her body instinctively slowing, listening for sounds that might never come. Isabella's room stayed closed. Too closed, no visitors, no nurse, no sunlight. Vanessa watched her. Not openly. Never openly. Her gaze slipped toward Sophie when others were near, then away again, casual and unremarkable. But when they passed in hallways, Vanessa's fingers brushed Sophie's arm just a second longer than necessary, her voice dropping to a murmur that only Sophie could hear. "Careful," she said once, smiling sweetly. "You wouldn't want to misunderstand things." Sophie nodded, eyes lowered, pretending compliance while fear crawled beneath her skin. She had learned to read people long before this house. Her father's debts had taught her that smiles were currency and silence could be armor. But Vanessa Sterling was different. She wasn't loud. She didn't threaten. She didn't need to. She made you doubt your own memories, your own courage. By afternoon, Sophie noticed the first change in Isabella. A tray of food sat untouched outside her door. The tea smelled wrong, too sharp, too bitter. Sophie didn't knock. She wasn't allowed to. She just stood there longer than necessary, memorizing the small details, the time, the guard on duty, The name of the nurse who hadn't shown up. That night, rain returned. The sound tapped against the glass like impatient fingers. Sophie was folding sheets in the laundry room when the scream tore through the house. It wasn't loud. It wasn't long. But it was real. Sophie dropped what she was holding and ran. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. She took the servants' staircase 2 steps at a time, ignoring the sharp burn in her lungs, ignoring the warning voice in her head telling her to stop. By the time she reached the West Wing, guards were already there, standing stiffly outside Isabella's room. Vanessa stood among them, pale, shaken, wrapped in a silk robe as if she had just been woken from sleep. She collapsed. Vanessa said softly, "I tried to help." The door opened. Sophie glimpsed Isabella lying still on the bed, her chest rising too fast, her skin slick with sweat. A doctor hurried past, barking orders. Sophie pressed herself against the wall, unseen, watching as Vanessa followed, tears glistening perfectly in her eyes. No one questioned her. Why would they? She was the fiancée, the future. Lorenzo returned just before dawn. The air shifted the moment he stepped inside. His presence carried weight and unspoken command that bent everyone around him into order. Sophie watched from the shadows as he listened to the doctor's report, his face carved from stone. Isabella was alive. Stable. For now. Vanessa clung to him, her fingers digging into his sleeve, whispering how frightened she had been, how helpless. Lorenzo held her, but his eyes drifted past her shoulder, scanning the room. They landed on Sophie. Just for a second. Something unreadable flickered their curiosity. Perhaps, or instinct. Sophie's heart skipped. She lowered her gaze immediately, but the feeling lingered. Being seen by Lorenzo Moretti was not safety. It was a question mark, a dangerous one. Later, when the house quieted again, Sophie found Isabella alone for the first time. A guard had stepped away. The nurse was distracted. The door wasn't fully closed. Sophie slipped inside. Isabella looked smaller in the bed, fragile in a way Sophie hadn't seen before. Her eyes opened slowly, recognition dawning as Sophie approached. "You?" Isabella whispered, her voice barely there. Sophie nodded, unable to trust her own voice. She reached for Isabella's hand, feeling the faint tremor beneath her skin. The silk scarf was gone, but the marks remained, red and unmistakable. "Don't tell him," Isabella murmured, fear tightening her grip. "He won't hear it. Not yet." Sophie swallowed. She wanted to promise something, anything but promises were dangerous. "Instead," she said quietly, "I won't let her hurt you." Isabella searched her face, as if weighing the cost of belief. Then she closed her eyes. Exhaustion winning. Sophie left the room feeling heavier than before. She began to watch more closely. Patterns emerged. Vanessa always prepared Isabella's medication herself. The nurse's schedule changed without explanation. The security camera outside the West Wing glitched at the same hour every night. Small details. Easy to dismiss. Impossible to ignore once seen. And Vanessa knew Sophie was watching. Their next encounter happened in the greenhouse, late evening. Vanessa stood among the roses, trimming dead petals with surgical precision. She didn't turn when Sophie entered. "You're loyal," Vanessa said calmly. "I admire that." Sophie stopped a few steps away, hands clasped. "I just do my job." Vanessa smiled faintly. Loyalty is dangerous when misplaced. She finally turned, eyes sharp, assessing. "People disappear here," she continued softly, "not because they're guilty, but because they're inconvenient." Sophie met her gaze, heart racing, but she didn't look away. Vanessa tilted her head, studying her. "You should remember your place." Sophie understood the message clearly. That night, as thunder rolled over the mansion, Sophie made a decision she couldn't take back. She began to remember everything. Times, faces, words. She etched them into her mind like evidence carved into stone. She didn't know how yet. She didn't know when. But she knew this much with terrifying certainty: Vanessa Sterling was not done. And neither was Sophie. The night arrived without warning, slipping over the Moretti mansion like a held breath. The air felt heavy, charged with something unsaid. Sophie sensed it the moment she stepped into the corridor leading to the West Wing. The guards had changed again, new faces, unfamiliar rhythms. Too many doors were closed, too many lights left off. Vanessa had planned something. Sophie moved carefully, her steps quiet against the polished floor. She told herself she was imagining things, that fear had sharpened her instincts beyond reason. But fear had never lied to her before. It was the only thing that had kept her alive for years. She reached the corner just as the last guard turned away, distracted by a call on his radio. Sophie didn't hesitate. She slipped into the shadowed alcove near Isabella's room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. Inside, the lights were dim. Vanessa stood beside the bed, calm and composed, her movements unhurried. Isabella lay restrained again, her wrists bound to the rails this time, her breathing shallow, uneven. A tray sat on the table nearby, a glass of water, a small bottle Sophie recognized instantly. Her stomach dropped. Vanessa lifted the bottle, checking the label with exaggerated care. "This one works faster," she said softly, almost conversationally. "The heart won't struggle as long." Isabella tried to speak, but only a weak sound escaped her throat. Sophie felt something snap inside her. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She acted. The door burst open under her weight, slamming against the wall with a sharp crack. Vanessa turned just as Sophie crossed the room, knocking the bottle from her hand. It shattered on the floor, liquid splashing across the marble. "What are you doing?" Vanessa hissed, fury breaking through her mask. Sophie shoved herself between Vanessa and the bed, her hands shaking, her voice raw. "Get away from her." For a moment, neither woman moved. The room vibrated with tension, thick and suffocating. Vanessa's eyes darkened, calculating, then narrowed with cold amusement. "You really are stupid," she said. "Did you think you could save her?" She stepped forward. Sophie stepped back instinctively, her leg hitting the bed frame. Isabella whimpered. Vanessa's hand came out of nowhere, striking Sophie across the face. Pain exploded behind her eyes, sharp and blinding. Sophie stumbled but didn't fall. She tasted blood. Something in Vanessa shifted, then annoyance giving way to rage. She lunged. The struggle was messy, desperate. Sophie grabbed for anything within reach, her fingers closing around the edge of the bedside table. It tipped, crashing to the floor. Vanessa lost her balance for just a second. That second was enough. They went down together. Vanessa hit the marble hard. The sound echoed through the room. Her head struck the corner of the overturned table, blood blooming dark against her hair. Silence followed, sudden and absolute. Sophie scrambled to her feet, breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were slick with blood Vanessa's. She realized dimly. Panic surged, but she forced it down. There was no time. She rushed to Isabella, fumbling with the restraints, her fingers clumsy with fear. "It's okay," she whispered. "I've got you." The scarf loosened. Isabella sagged forward, trembling. Alive. Footsteps thundered outside the door. Sophie turned just as it flew open. Lorenzo Moretti stood there, rain-soaked, a gun already raised. Guards poured in behind him, shouting, weapons drawn. His gaze took in the scene in a single devastating sweep: the overturned furniture, the shattered glass, Vanessa unconscious on the floor, and Sophie kneeling beside his mother, blood staining her hands. Time slowed. Vanessa stirred, letting out a soft, broken sob. "Lorenzo," she whispered weakly. "She attacked us. She's lost her mind." Guards moved forward instinctively. "Stop," Lorenzo said. His voice cut through the chaos like steel. He didn't lower the gun. He didn't raise it further. He just stood there, eyes locked on Sophie. She felt pinned in place, unable to move, unable to speak. Everything she had been holding back crashed into her chest at once. "I tried to help," she said finally, the words tearing out of her. She was going to kill her. Lorenzo didn't answer. Isabella reached out then, her fingers trembling as they brushed Sophie's sleeve. "She saved me," she whispered. "She saved me." Vanessa cried out, hysterical now. "She's lying. She's been watching us, poisoning you against me. She's a rat." "Lorenzo, you know what you do to rats." The word hung in the air. Lorenzo closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, something had changed. Not certainty, not doubt. Something colder, more dangerous. "Take Vanessa to the guest wing," he ordered quietly. "Get a doctor." "What about her?" one of the guards asked, nodding toward Sophie. Lorenzo's gaze returned to Sophie. Her knees trembled under the weight of it. She waited for the sentence. "The end. Lock her in the lower room," he said. "No one touches her." Vanessa stared at him in shock. "Lorenzo." "Now," he snapped. As guards pulled Sophie to her feet, she met Lorenzo's eyes one last time. There was no hatred there. No mercy either. Only a sharp, unsettling focus, as if he were looking at a puzzle he hadn't decided how to solve. As the door closed behind her and darkness swallowed the corridor, Sophie understood something with chilling clarity. She had crossed the line, and Lorenzo Moretti had just begun to wonder which woman in his house was the real danger. The lower room smelled of stone and iron. It wasn't a cell, not officially, but it had been designed for waiting for orders, for decisions, for endings. Sophie sat on the narrow bench with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her pulse still racing from the way the guards' grips had bruised her arms. No chains, no blood. That alone told her something was different. Lorenzo Moretti did not hesitate when he chose violence. The fact that he hadn't chosen it yet was more terrifying than any immediate punishment. Time lost its shape in the silence. Somewhere above her, the mansion continued breathing, doors opening, footsteps crossing marble, voices low and controlled. Sophie tried to steady her thoughts, but they spiraled back to the same image: Vanessa on the floor. Blood in her hair, the look in Lorenzo's eyes when he'd seen Sophie kneeling beside his mother. It hadn't been rage. It hadn't been trust either. It had been calculation. The door opened without warning. Lorenzo stepped inside alone. He removed his coat slowly, folding it over the back of a chair as if this were a business meeting rather than a reckoning. The gun was gone. That, too, meant something. He sat across from her, far enough to remain untouchable, close enough that Sophie felt the gravity of his presence press against her chest. "Look at me," he said. Sophie lifted her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His gaze moved over her face, lingering on the faint bruise already blooming along her cheekbone, the dried blood at the corner of her mouth. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You understand what this looks like," Lorenzo said calmly. "Yes," Sophie answered. Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised by that. "My fiancé injured. My mother restrained. You in the middle of it," he continued. "I've killed men for less confusion." "I know," Sophie said. "That's why I didn't run." That caught his attention. His eyes sharpened slightly. "Why didn't you?" "Because running would make me guilty," she said, "and because your mother would be dead by morning." Silence stretched between them. Lorenzo leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You're either very brave," he said, "or very stupid. Both." Sophie replied before she could stop herself. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Tell me everything," he said, "and choose your words carefully. This is the only time I'll ask." So she did. She told him about the first scream she'd heard, about the silk scarf, about the medication that didn't match the prescriptions, about the camera that glitched at the same hour every night. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't beg. She spoke as if she were laying evidence on a table, piece by piece, knowing any exaggeration would destroy her. When she finished, Lorenzo said nothing for a long time. "You expect me to believe," he said finally, "that the woman I chose to marry has been torturing my mother under my roof. I expect you to check." Sophie said quietly, his eyes locked onto hers. The tension in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. He stood abruptly and walked toward the door, stopping with his hand on the handle. "If you're lying," he said without turning around, "you'll wish I'd killed you tonight." "If I'm lying," Sophie replied, "your mother won't survive the week." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Upstairs, the house was restless. Lorenzo moved through it like a storm held barely in check. He ordered files pulled, security footage reviewed, medical logs compared. Nothing screamed betrayal. Vanessa's alibis were flawless. Her concern was visible, her tears convincing. And yet, something gnawed at him, a detail that refused to align. Isabella slept fitfully, murmuring in delirium. When Lorenzo took her hand, she squeezed weakly, her eyes fluttering open. "She's still here," Isabella whispered. "The girl." "Yes," he said softly. "She is." Isabella's grip tightened. "Don't let her disappear." The words landed heavier than any accusation. Later, Lorenzo confronted Vanessa. She lay in bed, a bandage wrapped neatly around her head, her face pale and fragile. She reached for him, her voice trembling with rehearsed vulnerability. "She attacked us," Vanessa said again. "I don't know why. I was only trying to help your mother." Lorenzo studied her carefully, the woman he thought he knew, the woman whose ambition matched his own. "Why were the cameras offline?" he asked casually. Vanessa blinked. "What?" "In the West Wing," he continued. "Every night, same hour. A flicker so fast it could have been imagined crossed her eyes. Old wiring," she said smoothly. "You know this house." Lorenzo nodded. "Of course." But when he turned away, his expression hardened. By morning, the decision was made. Sophie was brought out of the lower room, flanked by guards, and led not to freedom, but to a smaller, darker space beneath the mansion. The order was deliberate, public enough to be seen, harsh enough to send a message. Vanessa watched from the balcony, relief softening her smile. She believed she had won. Sophie understood the truth as the door closed behind her. This wasn't punishment. It was a test. And somewhere above her, the wolf was pretending to turn his back, waiting to see who would move first. The basement room was colder than Sophie expected, not because of the stone walls, but because of the silence. It pressed against her ears until her own breathing sounded too loud, too alive for a place designed to erase people. The light above her flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows across the floor. She sat on the narrow cot, back straight, hands resting loosely on her knees, forcing herself not to shrink. This was what Lorenzo Moretti had chosen for her. Not execution, not interrogation, waiting. Hours passed without footsteps. No food, no water, just enough neglect to feel intentional. Sophie understood the message clearly. She was being displayed as weak, as expendable. Anyone watching would assume her fate was sealed, and that was exactly what made the trap believable. Above her, the mansion shifted into a different rhythm. Word traveled fast in houses like this through servants, through guards, through glances held half a second too long. By noon, everyone knew the how guy who had dared to touch the future missus. Moretti was finished. By evening, they were already speaking of her in the past tense. Vanessa made sure of it. She moved through the house like a woman reborn, fragile but victorious. A faint bandage peeked from beneath her styled hair, the perfect visual proof of her victimhood. She accepted sympathy with soft gratitude, her voice gentle, her eyes downcast. Only when she was alone did the tension leave her shoulders. Sophie was gone. Or soon would be. That night, Vanessa made a call from the greenhouse, her heels sinking into the damp earth as she paced between rose bushes. The number she dialed wasn't saved. "It's done," she said quietly. "She's out of the way." A man's voice answered, low and amused. "You're certain she's in the basement?" Vanessa replied. "Lorenzo's made his choice." There was a pause. "Good," the man said. "Then we move." Stefano Rossi had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone realized. He wasn't part of the household, not officially. He was a shadow on the edges of Lorenzo's empire, a man who smiled easily and listened too well. Ambition clung to him like a second skin. Vanessa had seen it the moment they met. He wanted power. She wanted a crown. Together, they were dangerous. The plan unfolded quickly. By morning, the first piece of fabricated evidence surfaced. A security officer reported suspicious activity near the docks, documents copied. Roots exposed? By afternoon, those same documents were discovered in a locker tied to Sophie's name, along with an old phone she had never owned. By nightfall, whispers of betrayal reached the inner circle. Lorenzo listened without reacting. He sat at the head of the long table, hands folded, expression unreadable as his men argued around him. Betrayal was the one crime his world did not forgive. The evidence, while circumstantial, was unsettling. Too neat, too convenient. "Bring me the proof," Lorenzo said finally. It arrived within the hour. A video file, grainy, time-stamped. A woman's silhouette passing documents to an unseen figure. The angle obscured her face, but the uniform was unmistakable. Sophie's. Vanessa stood nearby when Lorenzo watched it, her breath hitching at just the right moments. "I didn't want to believe it," she murmured. "But after what she did, maybe we never knew her at all." Lorenzo said nothing. He replayed the clip once more, eyes narrowing slightly. Something was wrong. The gate was off. The timing didn't match the shift logs he had memorized years ago, but doubt was a slow poison. Even he wasn't immune. As if summoned by the tension itself, news arrived from the West Wing. Isabella had collapsed. The call reached Lorenzo just as midnight settled over the city. He was on his feet before the words finished forming, moving through the halls with lethal speed. Vanessa followed, panic etched across her face. Isabella lay pale against white sheets, her chest rising too fast, her pulse erratic. Doctors crowded the room, voices urgent. Vanessa hovered near the bed, wringing her hands, whispering prayers she did not mean. She took her medication. Vanessa said shakily, "Exactly as prescribed." Lorenzo watched the monitor, his jaw clenched. Something inside him twisted not fear, but recognition. He had seen this pattern before. Slow deterioration, sudden collapse, controlled chaos. "Check the dosage," he ordered. The doctor hesitated. "It's within range, but Lorenzo pressed. "But it's higher than usual," the doctor admitted. "Just enough to be dangerous for someone her age." Vanessa gasped softly. "That's impossible." Lorenzo turned toward her slowly. "Is it?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Why would you even ask me that?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Down in the basement. Sophie felt it. A shift. A tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with hunger or cold. She stood abruptly, pressing her palm against the stone wall as if she could sense what was happening above. Isabella was in danger again. Sophie was certain of it. Footsteps approached. The door opened, and Bruno stepped inside. He didn't look at her at first. He set a bottle of water on the floor between them, then met her gaze. "She's alive," he said quietly. Sophie exhaled shakily. For now. Bruno studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "You were right to speak. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't justice. But it was confirmation. Above them all." Vanessa watched the machines keeping Isabella alive and understood something had gone wrong. Lorenzo wasn't convinced. The wolf hadn't accepted the lie. And as Stefano pushed his pieces into place, confident the board belonged to him, none of them realized the truth tightening around their throats. The trap wasn't closing on Sophie. It was closing on everyone else. The alarms began screaming just after midnight. Red lights pulsed through the West Wing, bathing the corridor in an urgent glow. Doctors rushed in and out of Isabella Moretti's room, their voices sharp, clipped, edged with something dangerously close to panic. Her heart rate spiked, then dropped. The monitor stuttered, hesitated, as if unsure whether to keep going. Lorenzo stood at the foot of the bed, motionless. The world could have been ending around him, and he would have looked the same still, watchful, calculating. But inside, something was unraveling. He had buried men, ordered wars, dismantled families without blinking. The idea of losing his mother was the one weakness he had never allowed himself to examine. Vanessa hovered beside him, pale and trembling. She was fine an hour ago. She whispered, "I swear, I gave her the medicine myself." Lorenzo's eyes flicked to her for half a second, then back to the monitor. "Exactly," he said quietly. The doctor turned. "We need to stabilize her. Now. But something's interfering with the medication. It's almost as if she's being poisoned." Lorenzo finished. The word hit the room like a slap. Vanessa gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "That's insane." Lorenzo didn't argue. He simply reached for the chart and scanned it with unnerving speed. Dosages, timing, patterns. His jaw tightened. "Down in the basement." Sophie felt the change before anyone spoke her name. Her chest constricted, breath turning shallow, a familiar panic rising in her throat. Isabella was slipping. Sophie knew it with the same certainty she'd known everything else. The door opened, Bruno stepped aside, and Lorenzo walked in. The air in the small room shifted instantly. Sophie stood, her heart hammering, eyes locking onto his. There was no anger in his expression, no accusation, only urgency. "Tell me," Lorenzo said, cutting straight to it. "What's happening to my mother?" Sophie didn't hesitate. "The dosage," she said. "It's being increased in tiny amounts, enough to look like natural deterioration, enough to kill her slowly." Lorenzo's gaze sharpened. "How do you know?" "Because I've watched it," Sophie replied. "Every day. The timing, the nurse rotation, the cameras going offline. And because the medication she's on doesn't cause sudden spikes like that unless it's being manipulated." A beat, then another. "Can you help her?" Lorenzo asked. The question stunned her. "Yes," Sophie said immediately. "But I need to see her. Now." There was no debate. Lorenzo turned and walked out, expecting her to follow. They moved through the mansion without escort, without explanation. Servants flattened themselves against the walls as they passed. Sophie barely registered them. All her focus narrowed to the room ahead, the woman lying between life and death. When they entered, Vanessa turned sharply, eyes widening. "What is she doing here? She's saving your life," Lorenzo said flatly, not looking at her. Sophie crossed the room, hands steady despite the chaos, ignoring Vanessa completely. She leaned over Isabella, scanning the monitors, the IV lines, the chart. She spoke quickly, decisively, her voice cutting through the noise. "Stop the infusion," she told the doctor. "Now. Switch to saline. Her heart can't handle another spike." The doctor hesitated.
"Who are you? The only one who noticed this before it almost killed her," Sophie said. "Do it." Lorenzo nodded once. That was all it took. The infusion was stopped. Sophie adjusted Isabella's position, checking her pulse, murmuring softly to her as if grounding her back into the world. Minutes stretched. The monitor steadied. The wild fluctuations eased into something slower, weaker, but stable. Isabella's breathing evened out. The room exhaled as one. Vanessa stood frozen, her face drained of color. "This is absurd," she said weakly. "You're letting a maid give medical orders?" Lorenzo turned to her slowly. "A maid just saved my mother," he said. "What have you done tonight?" The question was quiet. Deadly. Vanessa faltered. "Just for a second." It was enough. Lorenzo looked back at Sophie. Something unreadable moved through his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or guilt. "Stay," he said softly. Sophie nodded, remaining at Isabella's side.
She felt Lorenzo's presence behind her. Solid, protective in a way she hadn't expected. It unsettled her more than fear ever had. Later, when the room finally emptied, Isabella stirred. Her eyes opened, unfocused but aware. She looked at Sophie, recognition blooming through exhaustion. "You came back," Isabella whispered. "I told you I would." Sophie replied. Isabella's fingers curled weakly around hers. "My son, he doesn't see easily," she murmured. "But he learns." Sophie glanced over her shoulder. Lorenzo stood by the window, watching the city lights beyond the glass. For the first time since she had met him, his mask had cracked. The wolf was still there, but so was the sun. Vanessa watched them both and understood the truth with chilling clarity. She was losing. That night, Lorenzo ordered a quiet change. Security rotations were altered, cameras repaired, files reopened. No announcements, no accusations, just movement in the shadows. And Sophie was moved not to the basement, but to a guarded room closer to the heart of the house. Protection disguised as imprisonment. Trust, still unspoken. As dawn crept over the mansion, Lorenzo stood alone in his office, replaying everything in his mind. The evidence, the lies, the girl who had risked her life with nothing to gain. He had chosen to listen. And in his world, that choice changed everything. By morning, the mansion believed Sophie was finished. That belief did not come from rumor alone. Lorenzo made sure it didn't. The order was delivered with deliberate cruelty. Sophie was to be returned to the lower level, stripped of privileges, denied visitors. Guards escorted her through the halls in full view of the staff, their grips firm, their expressions cold. The message was unmistakable. Whatever mercy had flickered the night before was gone. Vanessa watched from the upper balcony, one manicured hand resting lightly on the railing. Relief softened her shoulders. The sight of Sophie being led away felt like confirmation, like air finally returning to her lungs. She had survived the slip. Whatever doubts Lorenzo had flirted with, he had buried them again. Good, she thought. The wolf had chosen his side. Sophie did not struggle. She walked with her head held level, eyes forward, her pulse steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. She understood the performance as clearly as Vanessa misunderstood it. This wasn't punishment. It was camouflage. The room they placed her in was darker than before, deeper beneath the house, cut off from the flow of servants and guards. No windows. One camera positioned openly in the corner. The door locked with a heavy, final sound. Sophie sat on the narrow cot and waited. Above her, Lorenzo Moretti played his role flawlessly. He withdrew from the West Wing, leaving doctors and nurses to tend to Isabella under heavy guard. He returned to business with ruthless efficiency, summoning his captains, demanding updates, authorizing shipments and punishments as if nothing inside the mansion were rotting. To those who watched him closely, he looked unchanged. To Vanessa, he looked convinced. She approached him that evening in his office, cautious but hopeful, her voice soft. "You did the right thing," she said. Letting her go would have been dangerous. Lorenzo didn't look up from the file he was reading. "Danger is relative." Vanessa hesitated, then smiled gently. "I'm glad you see that." He closed the folder slowly and finally met her gaze. "I see many things," he replied. The words sent a faint chill through her, but she dismissed it. Lorenzo had always spoken like that, cryptic, measured. It was part of his power. She leaned down and kissed his cheek, lingering just long enough to mark her place. When she left the room, Lorenzo's expression hardened. The moment the door closed, he stood and moved to the hidden panel behind his desk. It slid open silently, revealing a narrow passage. Bruno waited inside. "Everything's set," Bruno said quietly. "She's isolated. Cameras are looping." Lorenzo nodded. "Good. Let them believe she's broken." Down below, Sophie sensed the shift hours later. The camera light blinked once, twice, then settled into a steady glow that didn't quite match the hum of electricity in the walls. She rose slowly, approaching it. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. The door opened. Bruno stepped inside. Alone. "You have 10 minutes, he said. "No more." Sophie's breath caught, but she kept her voice calm. "What's happening?" "The trap is closing," Bruno replied. "But only if you hold. I can't," Sophie said. I have to. Bruno studied her for a moment, then nodded. Lorenzo believes you. The words landed heavier than any promise. He left as quietly as he had come, the door locking again behind him. Sophie sat back down, heart racing now, her calm cracking just enough to let the fear breathe. Belief was dangerous. It raised hope, and hope could get you killed. Vanessa made her next move before midnight. She met Stefano in the city, far from the mansion, in a private lounge shielded by music and money. She was sharper here, less careful, the mask loosened by confidence. He's suspicious, she admitted, but he's chosen me. Stefano smiled, slow and predatory. Then we accelerate. They laid out the final steps with ruthless precision. A public humiliation, a definitive betrayal, evidence so damning Lorenzo would have no choice but to sever the last thread tying him to Sophie. And when that was done, Isabella would be next. Not tonight. Soon. Vanessa returned home lightheaded with anticipation. She didn't notice the guard rotation had changed again. Didn't notice the subtle tightening of security around her movements. Didn't notice Lorenzo watching her from the shadows, cataloging everything. In the West Wing? Isabella slept under watchful eyes. She woke briefly, her gaze drifting to the doorway as if expecting someone. She's still here, Isabella murmured. Yes, Lorenzo said softly, standing beside her bed. She is. Isabella's fingers closed weakly around his. Don't let her think she's alone. Lorenzo squeezed back gently. I won't. That night, Sophie lay awake in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the mansion through layers of stone. She thought of her father, of the debt that had dragged her into this world. She thought of Isabella's frail grip, of Lorenzo's eyes when he'd asked her to save his mother. She had never planned to be brave. She had only refused to look away. Somewhere above her, the wolf sharpened his teeth, and everyone else, blinded by the performance, mistook his silence for surrender. The gala unfolded exactly as Vanessa Sterling had imagined. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in warm light, reflecting off champagne glasses and diamond necklaces. Power gathered in tailored suits and whispered deals, laughter threaded with ambition. It was the kind of night where reputations were sealed and alliances announced without a single word spoken aloud. Vanessa descended the staircase in white. The dress clung to her like a promise elegant, pure, flawless. The faint scar hidden beneath her styled hair only enhanced the illusion of vulnerability. Cameras followed her every step. Guests turned, smiles widening, admiration blooming effortlessly. Tonight, she was untouchable. Lorenzo waited at the bottom of the stairs. He looked every inch the king of the room-dark suit. Calm expression, presence sharp enough to cut glass. When he offered his arm, Vanessa accepted with practiced grace, her fingers curling possessively around his sleeve. The flash of cameras caught them together, immortalizing the image she had worked so hard to create. Above the music, whispers traveled fast. The engagement would be announced tonight. The scandal with the Maid was finished. The Moretti Empire was stable again. Vanessa believed all of it. She did not see the subtle movements behind the scenes, the guards shifting positions, the quiet nods exchanged between men who did not belong to her. She did not hear the silent countdown beginning in Lorenzo's mind. Deep beneath the mansion, Sophie waited. She had been cleaned, changed, her bruises carefully hidden beneath a simple black dress. When Bruno came for her, he said nothing, only gestured. She followed without question, her heart beating a steady, terrifying rhythm. She had imagined this moment in fragments being dragged out, being silenced, being erased. This was different. They brought her up through a private passage, one she hadn't known existed, opening into a quiet corridor behind the ballroom. The sound hit her first, the music, the voices, the life continuing above her suffering. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. This world wasn't meant for someone like her. Then the doors opened. The ballroom fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the entrance where Sophie stood, framed by light and shadow. A murmur rippled through the room, confusion spreading like a crack through ice. Vanessa's smile faltered. She felt it before she saw it, a wrongness in the air, a disruption she hadn't planned for. Her gaze snapped toward the doors, and for the first time that night, her composure shattered. Sophie met her eyes across the room. Vanessa's fingers tightened around Lorenzo's arm. "What is this?" she whispered sharply. Lorenzo gently freed himself from her grip. "The truth," he replied. He stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying effortlessly across the room. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said. "I invited you here to witness a celebration. But before that, there's something you deserve to see." A screen lowered behind him. Vanessa's pulse spiked. Lorenzo, this isn't the time. The first recording played. Audio filled the room, Vanessa's voice. Unmistakable, stripped of sweetness, cold, precise, threatening. The words wrapped themselves around the guests, tightening with every sentence. Murmurs grew louder, shock rippling outward. Vanessa stepped back, shaking her head. "That's fake," she said, voice too sharp. Anyone could manipulate a recording. The screen changed. Footage appeared grainy, but clear enough. A figure moving through the West Wing, adjusting cameras, replacing medication, pausing just long enough for the face to turn toward the lens. Vanessa's face. The room erupted. "Turn it off," she screamed. "The mask finally cracking."
Turn it off right now. Lorenzo didn't move. From the side entrance, Isabella Moretti was wheeled into the ballroom. The sight of her alive, alert, watching sucked the air from Vanessa's lungs. Isabella's gaze found Sophie immediately. She smiled faintly, gratitude shining through exhaustion. Then she looked at Vanessa. "That woman hurt me," Isabella said, her voice frail but clear. "She thought I was weak. She thought my son would never listen." Vanessa's world collapsed in an instant. Stefano emerged from the crowd, panic flickering across his features as the realization hit him. This wasn't damage control. This was execution. Not with bullets, but with truth. He reached into his jacket. Lorenzo saw the movement. "Down," someone shouted. The gunshot echoed through the ballroom, sharp and deafening. Guests screamed, scattering. Sophie froze as Stefano raised the weapon, his eyes wild, desperate. He aimed not at Lorenzo, at Sophie. The world narrowed to a single breath.
Lorenzo moved without hesitation. One shot. Clean. Final. Stefano collapsed to the marble floor, blood spreading beneath him like spilled wine. Silence crashed down, heavy and absolute. Vanessa dropped to her knees, her dress pulled around her, white stained by fear. She reached for Lorenzo, sobbing, words breaking apart before they could form meaning. "Please," she whispered. "I love you." Lorenzo looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You loved the power," he said. "And you nearly killed my mother for it." Guards closed in, lifting her to her feet. Vanessa screamed as she was dragged away, the sound tearing through the night she had believed was hers. The guests stood stunned, unable to look away. Lorenzo turned toward Sophie. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then he crossed the distance between them and placed himself at her side, not touching her, but close enough that everyone understood. The war was over, and the woman who had once cleaned floors in silence now stood at the center of the Empire scene, protected, undeniable. The ballroom did not return to music. Even after the blood was cleaned, even after the guests were ushered out under heavy guard, the silence lingered like a bruise. What had happened there could not be undone, no matter how many chandeliers glittered above it. A man had died. A woman had fallen. And an empire had revealed its true face. Sophie stood near the edge of the room long after everyone else had gone, her body still trembling with delayed shock. She hadn't screamed when the gun went off, hadn't moved when Stefano fell. Fear had locked itself deep inside her, cold and absolute, waiting for permission to breathe again. Lorenzo gave that permission without realizing it. He approached slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter her. Gone was the commanding presence that had ruled the room moments before. What remained was something quieter, heavier. Regret, perhaps, or responsibility? "You're safe now," he said. The words were simple, but they broke something open inside her. Sophie nodded, unable to trust her voice. Safe felt like a word from another life. Isabella was taken back to her room under full protection. Doctors followed, but she waved them away once they assured her she was stable. When Lorenzo came to her side, she took his hand with surprising strength. "You chose to listen," she said softly. "That's all I ever wanted from you." Lorenzo lowered his head. "I should have protected you sooner." Isabella's gaze drifted past him, toward the doorway where Sophie hovered uncertainly. "You still can," she said. That night, Sophie was given a room above ground for the first time since her confinement. The sheets were clean, the windows open to the city lights. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. Every sound startled her. Every shadow reminded her how close she had come to disappearing. Lorenzo stood outside her door longer than he intended to. When he finally knocked, it was tentative. "I won't come in unless you ask me to," he said through the wood. Sophie opened the door anyway. They stood facing each other, the distance between them filled with everything they hadn't said. He noticed how small she looked without fear holding her upright, how exhaustion softened the sharp edges of her defiance. I owe you more than an apology, Lorenzo said quietly. Sophie studied him. The man who had held her fate in his hands. The man who had chosen to believe her when it mattered most. You don't owe me anything, she replied. You listened. That was enough. He shook his head. In my world, listening is a beginning, not an ending. He told her then about the changes already in motion. Vanessa would not be imprisoned. That would have made her a martyr. Instead, she would be erased, stripped of influence, cut off from every alliance she had cultivated, sent away where power could not reach her. Stefano's network would be dismantled piece by piece, quietly, completely. And your father, Lorenzo added. His debts are gone. Sophie's breath caught. What? They never should have touched him, Lorenzo said. They won't again. For the first time since she had entered the Moretti mansion, Sophie felt something loosen in her chest. Not joy, relief, deep and aching. Days passed. The mansion changed its rhythm. Guards stood straighter. Servants spoke more freely. Fear retreated from the corners where it had lived for too long. Isabella grew stronger, insisting Sophie join her for meals, telling stories of the son Lorenzo had once been before power had hardened him. Lorenzo watched them together more than once, something thoughtful in his eyes. The distance between him and Sophie shifted subtly. He never touched her without permission, never raised his voice. When he spoke to her, it was as an equal, not a possession. That respect unsettled her almost as much as his authority once had. One evening, they stood on the terrace overlooking the city. The wind was cool, carrying the distant hum of traffic and life continuing beyond the walls. You could leave, Lorenzo said suddenly. No one would stop you. Sophie turned to him. Do you want me to know? He admitted. But I won't cage you to keep you here. She considered his words carefully. Leaving had been her dream for so long that she hadn't imagined what staying might mean. I don't know what I want yet, she said honestly. That's allowed, Lorenzo replied. He stepped closer, not quite touching her. Whatever you decide, I will make sure you're protected. Sophie looked at him then, really looked at him, not the wolf, not the king, but the man standing quietly beside her, offering choice instead of command. Her heart twisted in a way that scared her more than any threat ever had. Below them, the city lights flickered, steady and indifferent. The war was over. But something gentler and far more dangerous was just beginning. Spring arrived quietly at the Moretti estate, as if the world itself had learned to tread carefully there. The gardens bloomed again, roses climbing over old stone walls that had once witnessed blood and silence. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress. It felt lived in. Sophie noticed the change in small ways. Doors were left open. Laughter carried farther. Fear no longer clung to every corner like dust that could never be cleaned. Isabella walked the corridors again, leaning lightly on her cane, her strength returning with each passing day. And wherever Isabella went, she insisted Sophie walk beside her not as a servant, not as a guest, but as family. Lorenzo watched them from a distance at first. He had rebuilt empires before. That was easy. What he struggled with now was something far more fragile, learning how not to rule the woman who had changed everything. Sophie was no longer under his protection because of obligation. She stayed because she chose to. That choice mattered more to him than any loyalty bought with fear. Weeks passed, then months. Sophie's father came to the estate one afternoon, invited not summoned. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, humbled by the knowledge that his mistakes had nearly destroyed his daughter. Lorenzo met him with calm respect, not threats. The debt was gone. So was the shadow hanging over the man's life. You don't owe me anything, Lorenzo told him. Just don't make her pay for your choices again. Sophie stood frozen in the doorway, emotion tightening her chest as her father nodded, tears shining in his eyes. In that moment, she understood the depth of what Lorenzo had done. Power could destroy, but it could also repair if wielded by someone willing to change. That evening, Sophie found Lorenzo on the terrace, the city glowing beneath them. He looked relaxed there, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, the wolf finally allowing himself to breathe. I think I'm ready to leave, Sophie said softly. The words landed gently, but they struck deep. Lorenzo didn't turn right away. When he did, his expression was calm, even warm, but his eyes searched hers carefully. Where would you go? I don't know, she admitted. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that belongs to me. He nodded. Then you should go. There was no anger in his voice, no fear disguised as command, only acceptance. Sophie stepped closer. You're not even going to argue. A faint smile touched his lips. If I stop you, I lose you. If I let you go, I prove you were right to stay. She studied him, surprised by the truth in his words. You've changed. So have you, Lorenzo replied. The silence between them felt different now, not heavy, not dangerous, honest. I don't want you to leave because you're afraid, he continued quietly, and I don't want you to stay because you feel indebted. Whatever you choose it freely. Sophie reached for his hand before she could second-guess herself. His fingers stilled beneath hers, then slowly closed. Careful, reverent. I'm not afraid anymore, she said, and I don't feel trapped. Lorenzo met her gaze, something raw and unguarded breaking through at last. Then stay, he said, not as an order, not as a plea. Stay with me. The words settled between them, fragile and real. Sophie smiled softly. I will. The announcement came weeks later, not at a gala, not under chandeliers and cameras. It happened in the garden, under open sky, with only those who mattered present. Lorenzo stood beside Sophie, not ahead of her. Isabella held Sophie's hand proudly, tears slipping down her cheeks. This woman saved my life, Isabella told them. And in doing so, she saved my son from becoming someone he never wanted to be. Lorenzo took Sophie's hand, lifting it gently. She walked into my world with nothing but courage, he said, and she changed it. There were no crowns, no thrones, just truth. The empire adjusted, as empires always do. Those who couldn't accept Sophie's place quietly removed themselves. Those who stayed learned quickly that the rules had changed. Fear was no longer currency. Loyalty was earned differently now. At night, Sophie sometimes woke from dreams of locked doors and silk scarves. Each time, Lorenzo was there, grounding her with quiet words, steady presence. He never rushed her healing. He never asked her to forget. He understood now that love was not possession, it was patience. One morning, Sophie stood at the window, watching the city wake, sunlight catching in her hair. Lorenzo came up behind her, resting his forehead gently against her shoulder. You know, he said softly, they still call me the wolf. She smiled. Let them. And you, he asked, what do they call you? Sophie turned to face him, eyes clear, strong. They call me the woman who wasn't afraid to look. Lorenzo smiled, then truly smiled, and in that moment, the wolf laid down his crown, not because he had lost power, but because he had finally found home.